Kwaba, welcome back. If you are just joining us, we are exploring how our deep connection to the divine source gave us strength, guidance, resilience, endurance, and vision to live and move forward despite the crushing circumstances of enslavement. Our spiritual roots and ethical ways of being are the backbone of today's religious traditions. In particular, the ethical foundation of Ma'at from Kemet, ancient Egypt. Ma'at is truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, balance, order, and reciprocity. Ma'at is the highest expression of Kemetic excellence in moral and ethical living and was the core value for proper governance in the lives and times of the people of Kemet. It remains the foundational cornerstone for ethical and moral religious education today, even when we don't know it. The value principles found in Ma'at are a key part of many religious beliefs, including Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Baha'i, not to mention the thousands of indigenous religious systems among native peoples in Africa, the Americas, and beyond. Now, let me add a disclaimer before continuing. As made clear during the last segment, African people have always known God, and this information is not in any way commentary about the religious practices we currently embrace. As I have said before, we invented religion. But before the advent of religion as we know it, African people pondered the universe, ways of knowing the divine, and the fundamental questions of life, also known as philosophy. With the Ma'afa, the disaster of enslavement, it is not surprising that the first institutions African people in the diaspora created were religious. To be clear, Black spirituality in the diaspora is an extension and reflection of the strong connection to the divine presence our ancestors relied upon. Our connection with the divine was an essential survival mechanism witnessed across the Caribbean, the Americas, North, South, and Central. It is important to note that African spiritual traditions also made the voyage across the horrific Middle Passage, often practiced in secret or disguised in the religious practices of the enslavers. African spirituality modalities included Contemplé, Santeria, Obia, Yoruba, Orisha traditions, Vodun, and Rastafarianism, among others. Orisha traditions were easily concealed within Catholicism, with Catholic saints standing in for Orisha deities. More often than not, any spiritual practices originating in indigenous African traditions were disparaged, feared, and even outlawed by the enslavers and colonialists. The Obia tradition in particular was feared and outlawed, as it was believed to bestow magical powers wielded by freedom fighters such as Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica. Legislation outlawing its practice was enacted in the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Tobago. It is of note that one of the characteristics attributed to Obia traditions was extensive knowledge of plants and herbs that could poison and kill. This is most interesting when noting and considering the fear and execution of poison plots in Bermuda and throughout the Caribbean. Was Sally Bassett a follower of Obia? But I digress. To be clear, in terms of our connections to one another, our desire to spiritually connect, revere, practice the sacred, and cultivate a relationship with the divine was and is universal among Black people in the diaspora and the continent. In Bermuda, the desire of Black people to worship was discouraged. A law was enacted preventing Black people, whether free or enslaved, from being baptized in 1687. 110 years later, an Irish Methodist missionary, Joshua Marston, was imprisoned for 6 months for preaching to Black people in Bermuda. Beginning in 1808, Marston conducted integrated church services, believing that enslaved Blacks were indeed human. With a slaveocracy Bermuda, he had to overcome the vexation of both whites and the government of the day. Again, testifying to our determination to connect to the divine, enslaved Africans toiled by moonlight to build Cobb's Hill Methodist Chapel in 1925. It was completed in 1827 and still functions today. The first institution Africans in the United States established was also the church. In 1773, George Lill and Andrew Bryan organized First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia. In 1787, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones organized the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, after being literally forced off their praying knees. The establishment of churches was not only a reflection of our connection to the divine, but also an act of resistance to the oppression that was the bane of our ancestors' existence. The African Methodist Episcopal Church was the first independent Protestant church founded by Black people to specifically escape racism and discrimination by white congregants in the Methodist Church. Unlike the founding of church denominations for theological differences, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, commonly known as AME, was founded as an act of resistance. In fact, the establishment of Mother Bethel AME Church, Richard Allen sued the white Methodist establishment in 1807 and again in 1815 for the right to independently exist outside the decidedly racist institutions of white Methodists. Since the experience of racism was common for Black Methodists, Allen convened a summit in 1816 and formally established the organizational denominations from 5 churches from Baltimore, Maryland, Wilmington, Delaware, Salem, New Jersey, Attleboro, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In 1822, James Varick, born to an enslaved mother, founded the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in New York City for the same reasons Richard Allen founded the AME Church in Philadelphia. Varick was a fierce abolitionist and assisted freedom struggle by writing, preaching, organizing, gathering resources, and petitioning the government for human rights, including the right to vote. Famous Zionites whose daring deeds and great feats are celebrated by people of African descent today include Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Booker T. Washington, T. Thomas Fortune, and Paul Robeson. Both church organizations consistently and persistently fought against racism, advocated for human rights, and participated in social justice movements with its members politically engaged. Growth was steady for both. After the U.S. Civil War, AME and AME Zion churches proliferated throughout the South and North. In a powerful example of resistance and determined activism of these believers against oppression, especially slavery, the story of Denmark Vesey is instructive and has a Bermuda connection. Born in St. Thomas and still a boy, Denmark Vesey was sold to Joseph Vesey, a Bermuda enslaver captain. Accompanying Captain Vesey on numerous expeditions and becoming self-educated, they eventually left Bermuda and settled in South Carolina. There, Denmark Vesey, now a young man, purchased his freedom and became a preacher. He founded Mother Emanuel AME Church in 1817 in Charleston and used his education as a pastor to organize one of the largest uprisings of enslaved Africans in the South. Organizing over 9,000 men, they were instructed to attack, seize weapons, kill and burn and destroy all vestiges of enslavement in the city of Charleston. When the 1822 plot was overheard and reported by a house slave, Vesey and his associates were hastily captured, tried, and executed by hanging for plotting a major enslavement rebellion that shocked the slaveocracy in its size and magnitude. In a tragic aside, nearly 200 years later, on June 17, 2015, a 21-year-old white supremacist entered Vesey's historic church, prayed with the assembled, and then massacred 9 of the 11 people attending weekly Bible study. Pleading guilty, Dylan Roof was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, but he may be eventually executed by the federal justice system. Today, the African Methodist Episcopal Church community is a worldwide denomination with congregations in the United States and Africa. 13 AME houses of worship called Bermuda home. With a global membership of nearly 2.5 million, it is one of the largest Methodist denominations in the world. We'll be right back.